The world froze tonight. Screens lit up in living rooms, airport terminals, crowded subway cars. Every device buzzed with the same words, sharp as sirens, heavy as a funeral bell. Russia declares World War III has begun. It was just past midnight in Washington when the first push notifications hit. In London, alarms rattled Downing Street windows. In Berlin, ministers were dragged from sleep into conference rooms lit like bunkers. Across the globe, families stared at their phones, their hands trembling, trying to decide whether to believe their eyes or pray it was a glitch. What began as whispers in diplomatic corridors, briefings spoken in hushed tones, warnings brushed off as posturing erupted into the words no one thought they'd hear again. World War III. On television, anchors struggled to keep their voices steady. The ticker screamed red, all caps. Russia declares. Experts cut in with breaking interpretations, some pale, some sweating, none offering comfort. Old footage of tanks rolling through frozen terrain was replayed like prophecy fulfilled. The chaos wasn't confined to government halls or newsroom studios. You could feel it in the streets. Car horns blared longer. People clutched one another tighter. Strangers whispered in subways, "Is this it? Did it really start?" And in the West, where the post-war order was supposed to be unbreakable, leaders scrambled. Secure lines lit up. Military commands shifted into high alert. Fighter jets readied under starless skies. Presidents, prime ministers, defense ministers all forced to confront what generations had sworn would never happen again. But beneath the noise of breaking broadcasts and the blur of spinning headlines, one truth hung heavier than all. This wasn't just a threat. It wasn't just another round of diplomatic chess. This was a declaration, one that pierced through the comfort of decades and reminded millions that history has a cruel way of repeating itself. And yet, what unfolded tonight wasn't only about armies, treaties, or maps on a strategist's wall. It was about the lives caught in the middle, the fragile faith of those who had believed in peace, and the thunderous arrogance of those who gambled it away. Because this wasn't just a headline, it was a declaration that shook the very foundations of the West. Why does this moment matter? Because in one instant, the fragile balance that had held the world together for nearly 80 years snapped. We are not talking about skirmishes on distant borders or the usual bluster of power politics. We are talking about the two largest nuclear powers on Earth, nations, with enough warheads to incinerate civilization many times over, standing on opposite sides of a red line that just vanished. For NATO, the declaration wasn't just rhetoric. It was a direct challenge to the very foundation of the alliance. Article 5. The promise that an attack on one is an attack on all suddenly shifted from a theoretical principle to a countdown clock. The phones rang inside Brussels, military planners working through the night, racing to map out the unthinkable, how to respond to a war that might not stop at conventional weapons. Markets across the globe convulsed. Within minutes of the headline, futures plunged into chaos. The yen spiked, the dollar wavered, the euro cracked under panic. Oil surged past thresholds unseen in decades. Cryptocurrency exchanges froze under the weight of frantic trades, as though digital coins could shield people from nuclear fire. Trillions of dollars evaporated in the span of an hour, and yet no one cared about numbers because numbers don't matter when mushroom clouds loom in the imagination. And then there were the civilians. For millions, bedtime turned into a nightmare. In Warsaw, parents woke their children and began to pack bags, haunted by the ghost of 1939. In New York, families who had once practiced fire drills now whispered about fallout shelters. In Seoul, in Paris, in Toronto, the same image repeated. People staring at glowing screens in darkened rooms, faces pale, questions rising faster than answers could be given. Where will the missiles land? Will we even know when they're launched? This is what war looks like before the first shot is fired. The terror in a child's eyes, the silence between spouses too afraid to voice their worst fears, the gnawing uncertainty of whether tomorrow will exist. But to understand why tonight's declaration is more than bluster, you have to look at the strategy behind the madness. Russia's move was not random. It was not a slip of the tongue or the reckless bravado of a cornered regime. It was a message, sharpened and deliberate. Every syllable of World War III was aimed not only at governments, but at ordinary people designed to sow panic, fracture unity, and test the resolve of the West before a single tank crossed a border. And it worked. Already cracks began to show, commentators urging restraint, investors pleading for diplomacy, ordinary citizens begging their leaders not to escalate. Russia knew the psychology of fear, and it had weaponized it with surgical precision. Still, fear was only the beginning. Because even as the West scrambled, one fact remained. The cameras were turning, the world was watching, and Moscow was ready to show its hand. And when the cameras turned to Moscow, the world saw a leader who wasn't bluffing. To understand how we arrived at the brink of catastrophe, you must step inside the Kremlin's shadow, where ambition, paranoia, and cold calculation intertwine. Russia did not wake up one night and decide to declare World War III. This moment was built brick by brick, confrontation by confrontation, until the final wall of restraint crumbled. It began with Ukraine. In 2022, when Russian tanks rolled across the border, the world gasped. But Moscow did not. To the Kremlin, it was the continuation of a mission that had simmered since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Reclaiming influence, reasserting dominance, rewriting history. Sanctions followed waves of them, each billed as the economic blow that would finally cripple the Russian machine. Banks were cut off, oligarch yachts seized, energy pipelines strangled, and yet the Kremlin adapted. It courted new trade with Beijing, with Tehran, with any nation willing to trade rubles for oil. The sanctions hurt, but they also hardened. At the same time, the war dragged on, reshaping Russia's military. What the West dismissed as clumsy blunders were, in the Kremlin's telling, tests of endurance. Soldiers cycled through brutal winters, factories shifted into wartime production. And behind the rhetoric of defense and sovereignty, a darker mobilization stirred. Young men vanished from cities overnight. Trains carried recruits toward borders under cover of night. Families whispered about sealed orders, about neighbors who disappeared into the war machine and never came back. And still, Russia played the double game. At global summits, its diplomats spoke of peace frameworks and territorial compromises. On state television, commentators mocked the West's fatigue, insisting Moscow was ready to negotiate. But inside the Kremlin walls, the speeches told another story. Cameras captured the grand halls, golden eagles perched above crimson banners as President Putin's voice echoed, "The West wishes to see Russia diminished, dismantled. But Russia does not kneel. Russia will rise, no matter the cost." Each word was met with thunderous applause from loyalists, yet, behind their eyes, many understood the danger. For every mention of peace, there was talk of escalation. For every handshake in front of cameras, there was a missile test over icy seas. Russia perfected the art of contradiction, promising restraint while preparing for war. NATO felt the tremors. Fighter jets scrambled closer to borders. Warships shadowed one another in contested waters. In the Baltics, nervous governments pleaded for more troops, more assurances. Each incident, a drone crossing airspace, a submarine sighting, felt like sparks falling on dry grass. But the West told itself the same story it had repeated for decades, that Moscow blustered more than it bit, that deterrence would hold. Inside Russia, however, the rhetoric grew colder, sharper, more personal. State broadcasts framed the conflict not as a war against Ukraine, but as a war against the West itself. Commentators sneered about decadent democracies, about a NATO alliance stretched thin by its own divisions. Clips of American protests, European inflation crises, political dysfunction, they were paraded as proof that the West was weak, distracted, ripe for pressure, and so the contradictions mounted. Peace talks in daylight, mobilization at midnight, diplomacy in Geneva, weapons on the front lines. Moscow spoke softly in corridors it knew were bugged, but shouted fire in the streets it controlled. Each move calculated, each message layered, a smile to the camera, a dagger behind the back. The world wanted to believe Russia was cornered, economically isolated, diplomatically shamed, militarily drained. But a cornered adversary is often the most dangerous. And in that corner, Russia sharpened its claws. It tested hypersonic missiles. It threatened energy blackouts across Europe. It courted regimes that shared its hunger for chaos. It was not retreating, it was coiling. And then came the speeches that will be remembered in history books. Kremlin halls lit in ominous amber, flags draped like battle standards. A leader, calm but unyielding, staring into the cameras not just as president, but as executioner of a new world order. His words cut like ice. The West believes time is on its side. They believe Russia will tire, that we will bow. They are wrong. History is on our side, and history does not forgive weakness. Those listening in Moscow felt pride laced with fear. Those listening abroad felt the chill of inevitability. The West had treated these SPI. And just when the shouting seemed unstoppable, when every voice in the chamber fought to outmatch the next, something happened. A ripple of urgency swept across the floor. Aides whispering into ears, papers sliding across desks. Delegates froze, expressions shifting from rage to shock. Because what happened next would silence even the loudest voices in the chamber. For days after Russia's declaration, the world seemed trapped in suspended animation. Markets continued their freefall. Families stocked up on canned food and bottled water. Military stayed on razor's edge. But then something shifted. The West, accused of dithering, of hesitating, of being too fractured to act, answered with a force that even the Kremlin had not anticipated. It began with sanctions. Not the piecemeal restrictions of years past, but an economic onslaught that struck at the very arteries of Russia's survival. Overnight, the world's largest banks froze Russia's accounts. The ruble collapsed to record lows. Oil tankers bound for European ports were turned back mid-sea. From Silicon Valley to Frankfurt, corporations announced sudden divestments, cutting ties that had once seemed unbreakable. Entire industries vanished from Russian shelves in a matter of days. Smartphones, aircraft parts, medical equipment, all gone. The Kremlin had braced for pain, but not for this. The scale, the speed, the coordination stunned even seasoned analysts. Western capitals, often criticized for moving too slowly, had delivered a strike that left Moscow gasping for air. But the counterattack was not just economic. NATO mobilized with unprecedented urgency. Across Eastern Europe, armored convoys thundered down highways, their headlights slicing through foggy nights. Warplanes roared overhead in unbroken patrols, streaking the skies above the Baltic and Black Seas. Naval groups reassembled into strike-ready formations, their silhouettes dark against the horizon. What had once been drills became deployment. What had once been posturing turned into posture of war readiness. Even nations that had long shied away from confrontation stepped forward. Neutral states whispered about reconsidering neutrality. Asian allies pledged logistics, intelligence, and aid. Across continents, governments declared the free world would not be bullied into the abyss of history. The defining moment came not from a missile, nor a sanction, but from a microphone. At a hastily convened summit in Brussels, with cameras broadcasting to billions across the planet, the American president stood before a wall of NATO flags and delivered the line that history will remember. His face was solemn, his voice slow, deliberate, resonant. The Russian Federation believes it can frighten us into surrender. But hear me clearly. We will not be bullied into the abyss of history. We have faced tyrants before. We have seen empires rise and fall. And every time, freedom endures. Democracy endures. Humanity endures. That is the story of our past, and it will be the story of our future. The words hit like thunder. In that single declaration, the mood shifted from despair to defiance. Parliament halls in Europe erupted in applause. Crowds gathered in city squares, watching on giant screens, cheering as though victory itself had been announced. Social media blazed with clips of the speech, hashtags spreading like wildfire. Freedom endures, stand together, no to tyranny. For a fractured, fearful West, it was the rallying cry it had been waiting for. Even Russia felt the shock. In Moscow, state television struggled to downplay the speech, airing commentary that felt rehearsed, brittle. Anchors mocked it as hollow rhetoric, yet their eyes betrayed unease. For the first time, the Kremlin realized it was losing the narrative war, the theater of perception where power can be as decisive as tanks. Other Western leaders built on the momentum. France's president declared Europe would not cower before blackmail. Germany, once accused of timidity, announced a historic defense spending surge. Canada pledged humanitarian corridors. Japan expanded sanctions. From every corner of the globe, voices echoed the same resolve. This was not just Ukraine's fight, not just NATO's fight, but the fight of a generation against the shadows of the past. The media response was electric. Headlines blared, "Freedom's defiant stand. The West finds its voice," and "A line drawn in history." Commentators, who had weeks earlier predicted fracture, now marveled at the sudden cohesion. Late-night hosts, usually cynical, opened their shows with solemn reverence, replaying the speech's most powerful line, "We will not be bullied into the abyss of history." Students painted the words on banners. Protesters across Europe carried them into the streets. Even in countries far removed from the conflict, the phrase resonated like scripture. And then, the silence. After the applause, after the headlines, the world waited for Moscow's reply. Days stretched into tense hours, every broadcast scanning for signs of Russia's response. But when it came, it was muted. No fiery retort, no dramatic counterspeech, just a brief, controlled statement from a visibly tense Kremlin spokesperson. Russia does not respond to Western theatrics. Yet the tremor in his voice betrayed the truth: the theatrics had worked. The villain, so arrogant in its declarations, was rattled. Its defiance now looked strained, its confidence brittle. Analysts noted the sudden shift. Russia had stopped setting the agenda and had begun reacting to it. The narrative control, once Moscow's weapon, was slipping away. Still, no one dared mistake speeches and sanctions for victory. Russia's arsenal remained vast, its rage unchecked, its capacity for escalation terrifying. Yet the momentum of the moment had shifted. The West had found its footing, its voice, its defiance. And as the cameras cut away, a storm was brewing not just in parliaments but in the streets. The echo of the West's mic drop response didn't fade. It detonated across the globe in a storm of reactions that no government could fully control. If Russia's declaration had sent fear like a chill through the veins of nations, the West's answer ignited a wildfire of voices, memes, and movements. On social media, the hashtags surged like tidal waves. WW3 trended first, a blunt expression of fear that carried both disbelief and dread. But soon, it was joined by countercurrents of defiance. Stand with peace. Defend democracy. Freedom endures. Within hours, timelines became battlefields of their own. Clips of the U.S. President's speech replayed millions of times, translated into dozens of languages, stitched into TikToks, looped into remixes, framed with bold subtitles and booming soundtracks. Celebrities weighed in, amplifying the moment to audiences far beyond politics. Musicians posted videos calling for unity. Actors reposted snippets of the Brussels summit, their captions sharp. "Never again means never again." Athletes draped themselves in Ukrainian flags before competitions, refusing to remain neutral. Overnight, solidarity became a cultural statement, not just a political one. Memes, as always, became the internet's weapon of choice. One viral image showed the Russian ambassador at the UN drowned out by a superimposed tsunami of hashtags. Another depicted NATO leaders as characters in a superhero movie poster. Democracy cast as the underdog facing down an authoritarian giant. Humor softened fear, but beneath the jokes pulsed a clear message. The world was watching, and the world was choosing sides. Protests erupted in city after city. In London, crowds filled Trafalgar Square, candles flickering against the stone lions as chants of "No to tyranny" echoed through the night. In Berlin, demonstrators wrapped themselves in EU and NATO flags, their banners quoting the words, "We will not be bullied into the abyss of history." In New York, the streets outside the United Nations overflowed with marchers carrying signs for peace, their voices rising so loudly they could be heard faintly inside the chamber itself. And yet, the solidarity was shot through with fear. Markets tumbled deeper. Oil spiked to heights unseen in decades, sending shockwaves through global supply chains. Airline stocks plunged. Investors whispered about nuclear contingencies. Ordinary families stared at receipts for groceries and gas, wondering how long they could hold on. The storm was not just geopolitical, it was economic, emotional. personal. Every citizen felt it in their wallets, their workplaces, their bones. The fear was raw, undeniable. Parents tucked their children into bed with news alerts still glowing in their palms. Students debated whether their futures would be measured in jobs or in shelters. Couples argued in hushed tones about whether to cancel travel, whether to stockpile essentials, whether to even plan for next year. The dread seeped into every conversation, every kitchen table, and yet alongside the fear stood something else: solidarity. A sense that no matter how dark the hour, humanity could still lock arms. Refugee shelters, filled not just with Ukrainians, but with neighbors offering food, blankets, comfort. Crowds in distant countries, South Africa, Brazil, Japan, organized peace rallies, proving this was not a regional struggle but a global reckoning. Even in places where governments leaned toward neutrality, ordinary people flooded the streets to declare that they would not stand by as the world slid into war. The media amplified the duality. Doom-laden headlines about economic collapse sat beside stirring stories of volunteers, of heroes, of moments of humanity breaking through the panic. On television panels, analysts debated nuclear strategy while, in the split screen, footage of children drawing peace signs on sidewalks played. It was as if the world existed in two realities at once, one teetering on destruction,